Hey, it's Jackson Kirchis. I'm a partner at Happiness Means Business. And in this short video, I'm going to walk you through the business case, the serious business of happiness for lawyers. I'll share a little bit of research, but we'll start with some data here. So 2023, US law firms had an average revenue growth of about 6%. And this is despite actually a 2.1% drop in productivity. So what we see is there were fewer hours billed, but the rates were higher, and so you had a 6% revenue increase. In fact, the average lawyer billed 1,542 hours last year, which is down by 24 hours and down by 126 hours from 2022 and 2021, respectively. Additionally, we see the amount of lawyers has increased 30% from 2020 to 2023. And so historically, 30%, that's a huge growth, but historically, the amount of lawyers has outpaced the growth in billings. And so you have more lawyers, but actually fewer billed hours that have kind of leveled off in that sense. And so you have more slices of the pie, but not necessarily a proportionally larger pie. So what does all that mean? So well, on top of that, in my research and conversations, I found that there's increased competition from both within industry and from substitutes like alternative legal service providers, as well as internal shared services within companies that maybe used to be external to law firms. And we know that associate dissatisfaction, particularly in larger firms, has been an ongoing problem, something we hear about quite often. So what all of this really means, right, is that you have this kind of increased competition, you have more lawyers but fewer billed hours. What we see is an increased pressure and a need to both recruit and retain top talent. And on top of that, you get the question of how do you get most value from that talent? How do you keep them motivated, engaged, and productive, despite, of course, oftentimes long working hours? So I have a full talk on this, but what I think you'll find interesting is that I break down a research paper from Florida State University where a team of psychologists actually looked at this. And so when we think about, okay, well, how do we keep these, and particularly, as I said, that challenging place of oftentimes it's that kind of associate level, like how do we keep them happy? And what's more, how do we keep them engaged and effective and motivated? Well, there are some striking patterns that come from this paper that looked at a bunch of different data on law students and lawyers. And we see that external factors, which are often given the most attention and concern, things like earnings, which firm you're in, what your rank is, your law review membership status or whatever, had little to no association with lawyer well-being, while conversely, internal or psychological factors shown in previous research to actually erode in law school appear to be the most important contributing factors to lawyer happiness and satisfaction. And I'll share some of what those psychological factors are in just a moment, but there's one other fascinating data point that we see. So they look at different practice types and settings that demonstrate, again, this difference in the internal versus external. So attorneys in large firms and other prestigious positions were not as happy as public service attorneys, despite the differences in compensation and perceived status. On top of that, junior partners in law firms were no happier than senior associates, again, despite the bump in pay and the enhanced status of being at that partner level. So what we see is that overall, while lawyers, of course, have very different cognitive training and skill sets, that in terms of just what makes them happy and high performing at work is not all that different from just normal people, which tend to be more internal psychological factors than external ones. So let me briefly touch on what some of these factors are that seem to matter most for happiness and well-being amongst lawyers. You have autonomy, relatedness, competence, intrinsic motivation, and autonomy support. And each of those is what is called a psychological construct, which means it's sort of a specific concept. So you have autonomy, which is a sense of empowerment, that you have some sense of ownership and self-directedness over the work that you're doing. You're not micromanaged. You have relatedness, which is a desire to feel a sense of connection to your peers, to clients, the people you work with. A sense of competence. So you have a perception that you are growing and mastering the work that you do and that you're getting better, which often comes from feedback and witnessing from the people around you. Internal or intrinsic motivation, which comes from having an interest and passion and a sense of engagement in the work itself rather than chasing just external rewards. And then you have autonomy support, which is a specific construct that we see in any sort of power relationship. So it could be teacher to student, it could be parent to child. In this case, it would be manager to their direct report, is when you have that kind of power dynamic, but there are certain factors where the person kind of who doesn't have the power feels they are listened to, feels their concerns are being addressed, feels that they're empowered to do the work, but that they still have that support and guidance from the person above them. And so what you can kind of get at in all of those factors, if you pay attention, is that a lot of them have to do with leadership principles that you're not taught in law school, and some of them have to do even with things that we can do individually if you're an individual lawyer and not necessarily managing a big team. And so all of these things are learned, and all of these psychological factors come together to really make the difference when it comes to what makes lawyers happy and satisfied. And importantly, all of those factors I just mentioned, when you look at how they relate to well-being and happiness, are far above things like attorney income, class rank, and law review status, a lot of these external benchmarks. So the takeaway here is really that you can intentionally, whether you're talking about an individual or, of course, in a slightly larger firm where you have kind of leadership and culture dynamics, you can absolutely influence the happiness of your lawyers, and that's going to improve, of course, your productivity, your engagement, your motivation, and ultimately help you to retain the best talent, bring in the best talent, and maximize the potential of your best talent. And that is why happiness is serious business, especially for lawyers.